In the world of photography, image manipulation is a contentious subject. It seems like some photographers believe that any alteration destroys the authenticity of an image. How can you have Cartier-Bresson's decisive moment with caveats? Something has been removed from the scene for aesthetic reasons. And yet with so many of us shooting 14-bit RAW files that by their very nature beg for tonal adjustment, it's hard not to see that some post-processing now is necessary. I grew up in the C41 era, probably better known as 1 hour photo. There was also Polaroid around at the time. Now, it's not that these processes were immune to manipulation, but they certainly didn't lend themselves to it. It was very easy back then to believe that the camera never lied. However, that does not mean that photo manipulation is unique to this modern era. In fact, far from it. It seems the era I was born in was the exception rather than the rule. Back in 1839, when Louis Daguerre announced the first photographic process to the French Academy of Science, people were amazed at the detail that was contained within these images. It was called the mirror with memory. However, there was one thing lacking from Daguerre's process, and that was colour. It didn't take long for studios to start to offer to paint in colour over the photograph. It always strikes me as weird that you'd have a photograph taken and then somebody would paint over it colour. However, this first manipulation was born of one of the medium's shortcomings, and that trend would continue. Okay, so this shot here is one called Fading Away by a photographer called Henri Robinson, and it was shot in 1859. Now, the fascinating thing about Robinson is he's famous for saying any dodge, trick or conjuration of any kind is open to the photographer's use. And he goes on to say that if you bungle, then that's your fault, not the fault of the tricks, or we might say manipulations. And this photograph, Fading Away, is actually a combination print. It's 5 exposures combined together, and really he did that because of he didn't have the latitude with the medium he was working with. He was working with wet plate collodion, and you couldn't possibly get this kind of exposure value in an image without making a combination print. There was outcry though for another reason, and that is because Fading Away represented a young girl, I think Little Nell was her name, and she was supposed to be dying from consumption or tuberculosis. But as it turned out, she was just an actress. And so people were shocked by this, you know, and I love this because it's a double kind of fake. And it's one of the first high profile cases of image manipulation. So when we think about camera manipulation, we tend to think of it as a post-process thing rather than in camera. And as a result, I think we tend never to think of people like Ansel Adams as being manipulators of the image. We tend to think of them as, you know, being very straight photographers. Adams, when he was photographing Half Dome or El Capitan, famously said, "I saw the photograph as a brooding form with deep shadows and distant sharp white peaks against a dark sky." He said, "The only way I could represent this adequately was use my deep red Rattan number 29 filter, hoping it would produce the effect I visualized. I had been able to realize a desired image, not the way the subject appeared in reality, but how it felt to me." And I really like that. I love the idea of kind of Adams realizing that he can use this piece of dark red glass on front of an image in camera and create a much more dramatic and brooding image. And, you know, it's very true of that image. And it is a manipulation, but is that an acceptable manipulation? And if it was happening in post-process, it would be less so. Why is in camera so acceptable and post so unacceptable? I don't know. It's just something that's always struck me, and I love how Adams describes it as, you know, I've been able to realize a desired image, not the way it appeared in reality, but how it felt to me. And I think that's very interesting about Adams. So I'm going to move on to 2 very famous cases of photo manipulation. Probably the first one I'm going to talk about is the Pyramids of Giza. So famously, National Geographic used photo manipulation to realign the Pyramids of Giza in this shot. They claimed they retroactively repositioned the photographer, which is quite a mouthful and quite a way of looking at it. But essentially what they were saying is, listen, if the photographer had been this far back and he'd been on a longer lens and zoomed in, he would have, created this effect of the pyramids being closer. But I think people were quite shocked at the idea of National Geographic manipulating an image of the pyramids so it would fit inside of their magazine cover. Okay, so this is another great example of a very high profile photo manipulation scandal. This is the image of O.J. Simpson after his arrest. It's actually both magazines ran with his mugshot. And as you can see, Newsweek have decided to do nothing to the shot, whereas Time magazine heavily manipulated this image. They darkened down the side of his face, and both of these magazines came out the same week on the newsstands, and people could see that it was the same image that was used, but one had been heavily manipulated. And I think people felt that the darkening down of his face made Simpson look more sinister, made him look guilty, and people felt like that was a poor representation for Time magazine, and it came into a lot of question at the time. So really, what's the big deal? If you want to manipulate your images, manipulate them. If you don't want to manipulate them, don't manipulate them. No big deal. But the thing is that a lot of our mobile phones now are applying manipulation automatically in modes like portrait mode or things like that. And I've no problem with a mobile phone kind of creating a fake blurry background. But when we start seeing our mobile phones creating skin softening, it becomes something different. And the reason I say that is because it means that the photograph is no longer really any kind of representation of you. This is not how I look. That's not how I look. This is. And the truth is that nothing ages like wine. Well, maybe except one thing. Maybe except the photographs you have of your past. That picture I hated when I was 18 now takes on a totally different light as I'm 46. Photography has that magical quality. It has that quality to capture you at a certain time in a certain way in your life. And sometimes you see those images at the time and you hate them. But as you age, you get a different perspective on the you of many years ago. And so that's why the idea of kind of our mobile phones creating these manipulated, softened images deeply distresses me. I think it'll end up that people will have these kind of fuzzy graph memories of themselves in a retro look. And that'd be a real tragedy, because it is the one thing that photography can do that, painting and graphic arts can't do. Photography can capture a moment. It can capture you as you were then on that day. And that's something special. So maybe to sum up, I wonder, do we always need to edit our shots? There's times when image manipulation can really help you tell a story, but there's also times when image manipulation's been used to really mislead people. So whether you love to manipulate your images or whether you think it's an absolute travesty, let me know in the comments below. If you've liked this kind of random rambling little post, then let me know. I might do something else similar soon enough. But anyway, thanks a lot for taking the time to watch, and see you soon.